Thank you all for taking the time to join us. I'm Chris Palmisi. I'm a partner here in the real estate department at Cyfarth.
I'm Ingrid Manovitz. I'm also a real estate partner at Cyfarth Shaw, and I co-chair, along with Dennis Greenstein and Jeremy Cohen, the Condominiums and Cooperatives Practice Group here.
We know it's the start of a workday and everyone's headed to work after this, so we'll try to be as informative, but get everybody out of here as quickly as possible while still giving as much information as we can. We'll both be available afterwards to talk, to answer any questions if anybody wants to stick around. We'll be around to talk to anybody. So we're going to start with just a little bit of an overview of what Local Law 97 is, who it covers, what kinds of buildings, what kinds of buildings are exempt from it, and what kind of buildings have to follow what they call a prescriptive pathway rather than strict compliance. We'll talk a little bit about alternative pathways to compliance. After that, we'll talk about where do you start? What do you do if especially if you haven't done anything yet? What's the first steps that you should take to find out if you are covered, how to comply, and where to go from there. Next, we're going to go into a little bit of tenant collaboration, which is very important for compliance and even just to find out how your building is currently faring with the regulations and the caps. After that, we'll talk a bit about some financing. There are a number of financing mechanisms available to help cover the costs of retrofits, of energy audits. You sort of have to seek some of them out, but there are a number of available financing sources. So we'll go over that in detail and hopefully be able to provide a lot of information on some of the sources that the state and the city have set up for us. Finally, we'll end with just sort of an overview of preparation and implementation. Where do you go? How do you start to comply? How do you implement the things that we're talking about? And how do you, if you are subject and over the caps, how do you start to bring your building within the caps? Local Law 97. In 2019, the New York City Council passed a package of bills, generally referred to as New York's Green New Deal or the Climate Mobilization Act. The heart of that was Local Law 97, which sets carbon emissions standards and caps for most buildings within the city. The emission caps will be declining starting January 1st, 2024. The first reporting period is May 2025 for the period starting January 2024. The next reporting period is about 5 years later, and the caps will decrease. So it's possible that your buildings are not subject or not over the cap in 2024, but will be in 2030. So even if you're not looking to plan for the next 12 months, especially for folks that have longer budgeting seasons or longer planning, you're going to want to start planning even for the 2029, 2030 retrofits that you might have to do. Sorry, I didn't say something.
No,
I don't want to.
I don't mean to cut you off.
Failure to comply with the caps is going to result in significant annual fines. They're going to be year over year. It's not a one-time fine. Failure to report every year is also going to be significant fines. So every building that is subject is going to have to file paperwork with the city indicating what their emissions were for the prior year. And from there, either get fined if they were unable to comply with the caps, or hopefully have complied with caps and be good for another year or 4 years, depending on where you are for that reporting cycle. What the city wants is buildings to comply. they want to reduce emissions. They don't want to just take fines year over year.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. So we have some contacts at the Department of Buildings, and while it's perceived by many that local law 97 is somewhat of a money grab, a fundraising mission for the city, our contacts at the DOB have indicated that it's really not a money grab for the city, that the goal is to reduce emissions. And there are talks, and this is not official yet, but may be coming down the pike, and I wanted to give you this preview, but there are talks at the DOB about requiring buildings that are subject to fines to take the money that they've been fined, and instead of paying it to the city, actually prove that they're using that money and putting it back into the buildings to reduce emissions. So that may be something that's coming. We've heard a lot of building owners, clients included, say, I'm not subject to fines in 2024, and I'm looking at fines in 2030 that are not that significant versus the amount of work that may be required to comply. I'll just take it on the chin. We'll just pay the fine, and we'll continue to pay the fines because the fine amounts are much lower than the cost of the upgrades. And the city and the Department of Buildings is on to that. So the concept of requiring buildings to take the fine amounts and put the money back in is to avoid that thought that I'll just take the fine on the chin and move on. So it really is a goal to reduce emissions. And I'm not sure buildings are going to be able to get away with just paying the fine to the city and not actually taking steps with upgrades and retrofits to reduce emissions.
And a lot of the retrofits are going to be building wide, going to be things like HVAC overhauls. They could take months, and especially as folks are seeing fines come in and seeing reporting periods start, and even starting now, we're already hearing that contractors are already booking up and having trouble with getting the resources to get all of these done over the next 12-month period. So although the first reporting cycle is less than 12 months now away, it's still important to get started on planning, get contractors in place, architects in place, figure out what work is going to need to be done, and sort of get in the queue of getting the work on schedule to start to get it done. What buildings are affected? Commercial, mixed use, multifamily, industrial, retail, essentially every building. The cutoff is individual buildings that exceed 25,000 gross square feet. 2 or more buildings on the same tax lot that exceed 50,000 gross square feet. This includes co-ops. There are exemptions from this entirely. There are also some buildings that are subject to what they call prescriptive pathways, which is a much more lenient standard. Rather than strict compliance with the emissions cap, the city has a number of, I think there are about 13 or so prescriptive things that they want to see these buildings perform by December 31st, 2024. And if they have, not all of them, but if buildings show that they've complied with some of them and they've made good faith efforts to comply with them, the city will essentially tell them you're good for the next 4 or 5 years. Those buildings, the ones that are subject to the prescriptive path, are, of course, city-owned buildings, night shift buildings, houses of worship, buildings subject to things like Section 8, and I think importantly, multifamily buildings or mixed use with more than 35% rent-regulated dwelling units. So there could be a situation in which a building has both market rate and rent stabilized or rent regulated units, and if 35% or more of the units are rent regulated, it is, I would call it a much easier pathway to compliance. Some of the things that are in the prescriptive pathway are things that all building owners likely will want to do in order to help comply with the laws. They're sort of the lower hanging fruit, I would say. Things like repairing system leaks in the HVAC system, maintaining the heating system on an annual basis with good operating conditions, setting individual temperature controls throughout units or throughout the building, insulating pipes, insulating steam systems, upgrading lighting, weatherizing and air sealing. So these are all things that will help all buildings to lower emissions, to comply with the law. They probably won't be enough on their own for buildings that are subject to the cap to come under the cap. But they certainly are things that everybody should be looking at to help bring their emissions down. This all includes cooperative buildings, just to be clear. Again, same possible exemptions though, if there is a building that has the 35% minimum rent regulated units, they would have to follow or they could follow the prescriptive pathway instead of strict compliance.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
On the 35% of rent regulated, does that include, say, a building that was under the old 421A, where the units are subject to rent stabilization by virtue of getting the tax abatement? Does that count?
I think it does. Those rent regulations don't go away, right? The 421A.
Well, it would go away after the tax abatement, but I'm saying while it's technically subject to rent stabilization, it is a regulated unit,
Yep.
even though it's probably more in line with a market rate rent.
I think it does. We can certainly look
Yeah,
into
we
it.
can circle up after. The city has some information available online where they've taken data from the Department of Finance and indicate which buildings are likely to qualify for the prescriptive pathway. So, if you give us the address, we can input it for you and we can get an easy read from the city as to whether or not it would qualify. If it doesn't, then we can dig in further as to whether or not the abatement would bring the building into, set them on the easier path of the prescriptive pathway versus, the performance pathway.
There are a couple of types of buildings that are wholly exempt: industrial that primarily produce electric power or steam, and detached, semi-detached buildings that are 3 stories or less. So, unlikely that many buildings in the city will be covered by either of those. Just to give you an idea of what the fines might look like, there was a recent revenue report done estimating that around 3,700 properties will be subject to more than $200 million in fines starting in 2024 reporting cycle. And by 2030, more than 13,500 buildings will see in excess of $900 million in annual violations.
Yeah, and we can talk more later about the types of different projects buildings are going to have to undertake in order to meet compliance. If there's one thing you take away, well, I hope you take away many things from this presentation, but if there's one thing you take away, particularly the co-op and condo clients in the room, is to start planning ahead for these projects and to really look at every building project that you're doing through the lens of local law 97. Hallway, lobby renovations, right? Lighting has an impact on usage. So you should be looking at the types of lighting that you're using. A lot of buildings have lights in their hallways that are on 24/7, right? That those could be switched to lights that turn on when somebody comes out of their apartment or exits an elevator. All kinds of building projects can have an impact on and can make a difference in terms of achieving compliance with local law 97, facade replacements, roof replacements, windows, even upgrades to building systems, right? There are a lot of buildings that are undertaking replacements of boilers. Can you move from gas to electric? Can you select equipment that will not always be running all the time, but has sensors that turn off and turn on as needed in terms of usage? So I really want, especially the co-op and condo clients in the room, to take away the fact that you should be looking at all building projects going forward through a lens of local law 97 and what can be done in connection with that project to help you get towards compliance.
Excuse me, did I hear you correct? that a co-op should be converted to electric heat?
Not that co-ops should be converted to electric heat. There is a spectrum of emissions, right? So on the worst end of the spectrum is oil. It goes oil, gas, steam, and electric. So there are still emissions associated with electric, but they are on the lowest end of the spectrum. The more that you can electrify, the better. And electric's only getting cleaner as it goes. So to the extent that things can be converted to electric and you can sort of push away from the oil and gas end of the spectrum, the closer you will get to achieving compliance.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the ways that you can reduce emissions. And we'll talk a little bit about this in a few minutes too, but when you get started, you start looking at what you can do for compliance. There are reports that you can and should get that'll give you sort of a menu of what you can do, how much it might cost to do those, and how much it might save in annual both operating costs and also violations. But certainly that's something, and probably the heaviest hitter, but certainly that's something that buildings can consider. Alternative pathways to compliance. The good news is that these technically exist. The bad news is that they are largely still undefined, and I'm not all that certain that they will be that helpful. RECs, renewable energy credits, are certificates representing 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy delivered to the grid. Buildings are allowed to deduct RECs that they purchase from their annual emissions. The sort of problem with this is the city hasn't yet said if there's going to be a cap on how much RECs, what percentage of your emissions you can offset with RECs. There are and have been a number of reports done by both the mayor's office and a couple of other interested parties pushing the city to put a strict limit on and a low limit on the number of RECs that buildings can buy. The idea being it's probably going to be cheaper for buildings to buy RECs to offset 100% of their emissions to achieve compliance than it is to actually comply with the law. So while we don't know if there will be a cap, I suspect there probably will. And the reason for that is there already is a cap on one of the others, which is greenhouse gas offsets. Greenhouse gas offsets have been around for a long time. These are publicly registered offsets. They can be bought from a number of registered sellers, and they can come from anywhere. There could be trees planted in another state that you say, there's a greenhouse gas offset that I'm buying, and essentially the seller of those retires those trees from being able to be used by anybody else. Those are already capped at 10%. So if that gives you any indication on the type of cap that the city might put on RECs, and a lot of folks are pushing the city to put a similar 10% cap on the RECs. Use of clean distributed energy as offsets. Buildings that produce clean energy on site, so things like probably the most relevant for buildings in the city are solar panels right now on the roof. There may be technology, there is some sort of technology now where solar panels can be built into some of the glass windows, although it's not really as readily available. Certainly solar panels on the roof of buildings can be offset. So each megawatt hour that you produce from your solar panels gets reduced from your offset emissions. The exact formula is still not yet set, but I think in concept, this might be one of the ones that doesn't get capped because the city wants things like this. They want clean energy, they want it given to the grid. So whether you use it yourself in your own building or whether you enter into a power purchase agreement with the grid and sell it to the grid, you can offset this from your annual emissions.
Trust.
Yes.
What if you own multiple buildings within the city and you've got one building that's above a threshold and a number that are below the threshold? Is there any way to aggregate it?
So not yet. There is talk though, and the regulations, not specifically within local law 97, but there were others within the Climate Mobilization Act that talked about this, that would allow portfolios of buildings, if you have savings on one building, to allocate them to the other. Again, the city hasn't exactly said how they would do that, or if there is a geographic area where they would allow that. For instance, there's in some related but not exactly this topic, there is the city studied carbon trading basically, and one of the things that was important to the city was disadvantaged communities, and so they wanted basically the sellers of the carbon of these credits, the sellers to mostly come from disadvantaged communities to help put money into the disadvantaged communities. So it is possible that the city does allow that, but they want it to be only from buildings within those types of communities. So we don't know for sure, but it is certainly something that the regulations contemplate. But one of those things that they sort of kicked to the DOB and the other agencies to come up with some rules, and we just don't know yet.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll go through these quickly because we're sort of running a little bit long. Where to start? Determine first whether your building is even covered. Next, review your current usage and emissions. Many buildings that are going to be subject to this are likely already subject to the annual benchmarking reports that have to be filed every year with the city. That data and that usage is going to be important when you take the next step. An energy audit can tell you and will tell you where your building currently sits as far as where the caps are for both 2024 and also 2030. There are a number of companies, and we can connect you with a number of them that we've worked with that will do those energy audits. And they're not just audits that tell you where you are currently. They give it ideas for sort of a menu of here's what we think your annual fines are going to be if you do nothing. Here's what we think it would be if you do, let's just say, lighting retrofits. Here's what those retrofits would cost you. Here's what they would save you in operating expenses. Here's what they would save you in fines. And then they usually will give you 2 or 3 options of sort of the lowest hanging fruit, and then medium, and then very heavy, like electrifying the entire building. So it makes it a little bit more palatable and easier to digest, to see exactly where you might be able to make some savings and how much it might cost you annually.
And we've met with a number of companies over the last year, collected sample reports from various companies. So to the extent that you haven't already done a study of your building and need to do one, we can certainly connect you with different entities that can run that audit for you.
Those reports will lead to identifying deficiencies, seeing where you might be able to reap some benefits from savings. Finally, create a budget. Sort of figure out how much you need to spend, what time period you need to spend it over, and then start addressing deficiencies and expected fines. I'm going to keep moving quickly because I want to make sure we get to the financing. Tenant collaboration is going to be really important in most buildings, if not all. Tenants are the ones that are using the utilities, not the landlords, but the landlords are the ones that are in charge usually of paying for these building-wide retrofits. Over the past number of years, I think more recently especially, there's this idea of green leases and energy-aligned provisions in especially commercial leases, which have both tenant and landlord sharing data with each other, and importantly, sharing the benefits of reduced operating expenses. The problem had been tenants were the ones reaping the financial benefit of retrofits because their utility bills were going down, but landlords generally could not reap the benefits of savings because they were putting money into these building-wide systems, and because they were capital improvements, they could not pass them on to their commercial tenants. So tenant collaboration is going to be really important. We find that tenants more and more, especially national type tenants, are more interested in this concept and like to be part of the conversation with landlords about how they can share data, maybe share the incentives, and share some of the costs, but with both parties sort of reaping the financial benefits.
Take the review and amend governing documents piece on the co-op and condo front. It's important to review the existing documents, not only the governing documents, but things like alteration agreements. You have unit owners and shareholders in apartments doing renovations of their apartments, and you can use that as an opportunity to help achieve compliance. If you have adequate electric capacity, can you get a shareholder or a unit owner to cap the gas lines in their apartment when they're renovating their kitchen and use electric service instead? Can you amend the documents? Have the building's reviewing architect review the rules when alteration applications are reviewed, the appliances to be installed, the additional drain on the system, and whether the equipment that's to be installed is energy efficient and compliant. That can be done on an apartment by apartment level when people are doing renovations, and likewise in a multifamily rental context when apartments turn over and upgrades are made and renovations are made. Again, look at these upgrades and changes through a local law 97 lens.
Yes.
What sort of common area alterations might be considered as a result of an audit, and should we be concerned about what those alterations may trigger in terms of more current building code compliance?
So I would say common areas likely are things that exclusively serve common areas, probably things that, like Ingrid was talking about, the lighting, where it's not on for 24 hours a day. It's motion sensitive, so it only turns on, if someone's walking through. As far as compliance with other laws, I can't think of any that would be negatively impacted by upgrades like that. But certainly it's something to think about depending on the types of upgrades, like if it's building wide or HVAC. Again, I still don't think there's any sort of other local laws that will be negatively impacted. But it's certainly something to consider when you're looking at everything and you're trying to decide which ones to follow. And that'll be something that I think as you're looking at the types of retrofits recommended, you can take that into account with how much it's going to cost. Yes.
Piggybacking on John's comment, we're interior designers. We do public space, so we're very interested in knowing when we go talk to our clients, if aside from lighting, which is a given, and lighting is not only in the common hallway, but it's the stairwells, it's back of house, it's your garage, it's everywhere. But are certain products also encouraged? For example, there are carpet that has a certain type of rating. That doesn't off gas, that doesn't contribute to, and how it was produced, how it was shipped, how it was brought to the building. Paint, low VOC paint, wall covering materials. Are any of those count for anything? Because new construction buildings have LEED certification. So I was just wondering if that's another direction these existing buildings may go into.
So a couple things. You touched on what are generally referred to as scope 3. So how it gets there, scope 3 emissions. How it gets there, how it was sourced, how it was created, the emissions at, say, the factory where the carpet was produced. For now, these don't take that into account. These laws only take into account what your building specifically emits. You won't get credit for putting a carpet in that might reduce the need for heat because maybe it's just not as cold in the rooms. However, you may get credit in a way that you're not going to have as many emissions because you might need less heat in those rooms. So you may not be able to say, I put in 1,000 square feet of carpet, I should get credit for X. But you may see it in the actual emissions that the building is putting off.
Financing?
Yes. So we'll quickly go through the financing.
Yeah, Chris is going to go through the different options. There's no one size fits all for buildings here. There are a number of different programs, including rebates. Some of them have expiration dates. Some of the programs have a limited amount of funds. I'm not suggesting that anybody panic, that it's sort of a hurry up situation. The early bird gets the worm, right? The sooner you start pursuing these programs, the better.
So the C-based loans were sort of heralded as the way to help fix all of this or to help pay for it. Unfortunately, in the city, not New York State, but throughout the city, there's only been a couple of C-based loans in the past couple of years. There are a lot of hoops to jump through. Possibly the hardest one for many senior lenders is it requires senior lender consent. And even senior lenders that have a branch that does C-based loans are not yet comfortable with C-based loans being on their buildings. So there's still some, and the rulemaking around C-based loans changed about 4 months ago or 5 months ago. So their C-based loans have not yet really hit their stride. They don't apply to leaseholds, they don't apply to new buildings, they only apply for now in the city to building retrofits. There's a number of incentives, rebates, tax credits, and grants. The utilities in New York have put a lot of money into trying to incentivize their customers to do these retrofits. NYSERDA has multifamily building support. Some of these programs will pay for these energy audits that we talked about. Some of them pay for up to 75% of the cost of energy audits. Some of them will actually pay a percentage of the actual retrofit, depending on the type of retrofit and how much you think or how much it's expected to reduce the emissions. Con Ed and National Grid have very similar programs where you can apply for either grants or reduction in bills based on the work that you've done. New York State Electric and Gas Corporation also has some, especially multifamily energy efficiency programs where they'll pay for or give rebates for certain types of lighting. And then we'll quickly just close with preparation and implementation. Where do you go with all of this? The first step is really the energy audit. The most important thing is to know where you are and know what to expect. You know, is it something that's going to cost you money every year, or is it something that you don't really need to be concerned about? From that, create and implement an emissions reduction and decarbonization plan. That'll help you identify the opportunities for reduction. It'll help you monetize those so that you can better budget and better figure out where to spend your money. Create a financing plan, which doesn't just and shouldn't just include cash layout. It should also include looking at all incentives, tax credits, loans, and grants that you might be able to add to the capital stack.
On the review governing documents front, I already addressed that point. But in terms of budgeting, you know, a lot of condominium buildings in particular have restrictions in bylaws about how much a board can spend on projects without unit owner approval. So that's something that needs to be looked at. In terms of setting budgets for the year, you know, a lot of the boards that we've been talking to who are looking at increases in common charges or maintenance, looking, you know, at a 2% increase or going to 2.5% or 3%. Just to raise extra funds, earmarking the money for local law 97 projects, buildings that don't have flip taxes or considering passing flip taxes, you know, any way that money can be collected and allocated for these projects. A lot of them are going to be expensive, notwithstanding the rebates and other financing programs that are available. So start saving money now for these projects.
Review commercial leases. Start thinking about whether these are things that you can pass on to, especially commercial tenants. Are they things that are carved out from annual operating expense pass-throughs? To the extent that you're entering into new leases or modifications, you should start adding language in there that allows you to add pass-throughs to tenants and maybe split those costs. And start thinking about service, vendor, construction agreements. There's going to be general contractor agreements, architects agreements. If you have some in place already, start taking a look, seeing if there are things that would cover this type of work. You know, if they're not, you should start getting in touch with these folks because, like I said, they're already starting to see a crush for getting in line to start doing this work. With any of these, we can certainly help you review, negotiate, you know, the financings, the governing docs, commercial leases, modifications. And if there's anything that either of us or any of our teams can do, please reach out. We're always here to talk. We enjoy talking about this stuff, strange as it is. We will cut it there because I know we're a few minutes over, which I apologize for. But we'll both be around. So if there's anyone that wants to talk, please stick around.
Yeah, I was just gonna close with, call us, we're here, by us and you, Chris. We're here to help you, and we have an excellent, we're in both real estate partners, but we have an excellent team of construction attorneys that have done hundreds, if not thousands, of AIA agreements and construction contracts with architects, et cetera. So we're here to help you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for coming out, everybody.